Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're taking a profound deep dive into Anne Applebaum's essential book, Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine. Our mission is pretty straightforward today. We want to understand, really drawing directly from Applebaum's work, what caused the horrific famine in Ukraine. We're talking about the period between 1931 and 1934. We'll look at how it unfolded, step by agonizing step, and importantly, what the immediate consequences were for the Ukrainian people.
Right. And Applebaum's core argument, which we'll be tracing throughout this discussion, is really powerful. She argues this famine wasn't, some kind of natural disaster. It was, as she lays it out, a direct result of deliberate Soviet policies under Stalin.
Deliberate policies.
Yes. Specifically, things like forced collectivization of farming and these absolutely relentless grain seizures. And crucially, these were tied to a political goal, crushing the growing sense of Ukrainian national identity. So the famine, in her analysis, becomes a tool, a weapon, really, for national suppression.
A weapon. Well,
And beyond that, the book meticulously shows how the Soviet regime went to extraordinary lengths to hide the famine from the world, denying it even happened. And finally, Red Famine really illuminates the deep, lasting scars this tragedy left on Ukrainian society, how it shaped collective memory, national consciousness, things that still resonate today.
okay, so that's the framework. Let's maybe start where Applebaum does, looking at the historical currents that sort of set the stage for all this.
Absolutely. She starts by showing this long-standing pattern, almost a tradition, of external powers trying to undermine the very idea of a distinct Ukrainian nation.
How so?
Well, take someone like Belinsky, the 19th century Russian intellectual she mentions. His view was basically that Ukrainian history was just a minor stream, a tributary, flowing into the great river of Russian history.
So essentially denying their own separate historical narrative.
Exactly. And denying a people their history is, well, it's a potent way to undermine them. And it wasn't just history. Applebaum points out how the Ukrainian language was consistently dismissed by Russian scholars, by officials, as just a dialect, a patois, not worthy of being a real language.
Right, and the Polish view she mentions, the wild field.
Yeah, the Dziki Pola. This idea that the Ukrainian lands were somehow empty, wild, just waiting for external control. It kind of provided a justification, didn't it, for asserting dominance, especially given the agricultural richness of the land.
So against this backdrop of denial from outside.
Exactly. Applebaum contrasts that with the internal growth of a distinct Ukrainian national consciousness. And this was deeply tied, she argues, to the peasantry, to their language, their folklore.
Okay, so intellectuals played a key role here.
A crucial one. They were rediscovering and championing the Ukrainian language, the rural traditions. She points to Taras Shevchenko's Kobzar, published back in 1840, as a really pivotal moment.
Kobzar. What was so significant about it?
Well, it wasn't just poetry. It powerfully fused this kind of romantic nationalism with a really fierce critique of social injustice. It really helped ignite that sense of national aspiration.
And this wasn't just cultural ferment, right? It became political.
Absolutely. Fast forward to 1917, after the February Revolution, the Central Rada emerges in Ukraine. And as the book details, they propose pretty radical land reform. The idea was to give land directly to the peasants.
That must have been popular with the peasantry.
Hugely popular. It challenged the old power structures. The Rada statement, something like no one knows better than peasants how to manage their land, really captures that desire for self-determination. But this collided head-on with Bolshevik ambitions.
Ah, right. The Bolsheviks. Applebaum outlines their opposition pretty clearly, doesn't she?
Meticulously. It wasn't just disagreement. It was a deliberate strategy to destabilize Ukraine. They even set up these sort of fake Soviet republics in different regions, an alternative government in Kharkiv, which was a more Russified city,
Creating parallel structures to undermine the legitimate ones.
Precisely. And Lenin's view, as Applebaum highlights, was quite clear. Any Soviet Ukrainian state would lack real sovereignty. You see this in the appointments Moscow made figures like Pyatakov, Rakovsky put into key Ukrainian revolutionary bodies.
And these were people loyal to Moscow.
Completely. Some even dismissed Ukrainian language demands as actively harmful. Applebaum actually calls this period a form of Bolshevik hybrid war against Ukraine.
Hybrid war. That sounds unsettlingly familiar.
It does, doesn't it? So division, create confusion, prop up alternatives, then seize control. And the book shows the brutal reality when the Bolsheviks came back in force in 1919, the second occupation.
All the talk of Ukrainian liberation just vanished.
Instantly.
Right.
Once they had a grip, they immediately reversed course. It was almost Tsarist in approach,
Right.
banning Ukrainian language in schools, newspapers, closing theaters, and then unleashing the Cheka, the secret police.
The Cheka,
Yeah.
targeting intellectuals.
Yes, arresting them for supposed separatism. Even Rakovsky, who Moscow had appointed to lead the Ukrainian party, refused to even acknowledge the Ukrainian language existed as separate.
And the economic side, the grain.
Immediate and ruthless exploitation. Applebaum describes systematic grain requisitioning. Peasants saw it as theft by foreign occupiers.
And resistance was met with.
Extreme violence. So much so that even one Bolshevik official admitted, and this is a chilling quote, every pood tinged with drops of workers' blood. A pood is, what, about 36 pounds? So huge amounts taken by force. And this early period, the Civil War era, also saw just horrific violence against Jewish communities in Ukraine. Pogroms by various groups. Applebaum argues this sort of brutalized the whole environment, normalized extreme violence.
Setting a grim precedent.
Sadly, yes. It foreshadowed the kind of terror that would later be used against the so-called kulaks.
Okay, so that sets a very dark stage. But then the 1920s brought a change. Applebaum calls it famine and truce.
Yes, a relative change. By 1921, the Bolsheviks had pretty much crushed the major resistance movements and consolidated power.
So they eased up?
Somewhat. They introduced the new economic policy, the NEP. This meant relaxing the forced grain collections, allowing some private trade. And importantly, in 1923, Moscow launched this policy of indigenization.
Indigenization, Korenizatsiya, you mean, or Ukrainization in this context.
Exactly, Korenizatsiya or Ukrainization. This involved promoting Ukrainian language and culture, which seems contradictory, right, after trying to suppress it?
It does. What was the catch?
Well, as Applebaum explains it, the motive wasn't really genuine support for Ukrainian culture. It was more strategic. The aim was to make Soviet power seem less foreign, less imposed from Moscow, to kind of co-opt national feeling, reduce demands for actual sovereignty.
Ah, okay, so a calculated move.
Pretty much. And it did lead to a genuine flourishing of Ukrainian culture and intellectual life for a time, centered in Kharkiv. There were even attempts by Ukrainian communists to connect with Ukrainian populations in Russia, like in the Kuban region. Talk of cultural links, maybe even border changes. But Moscow always held the reins.
And this cultural breathing space didn't last long.
No. Applebaum really details how Stalin, after Lenin's death, started maneuvering. He used the grain crisis of 1927 as a key opportunity.
How so?
He used it to consolidate his own power against rivals like Trotsky and Bukharin, and crucially, to shift towards much more radical hardline policies.
And the peasants. What was happening with them in 27?
They were resisting again. Fears of renewed grain seizures were circulating, even wild rumors of a Polish invasion. This gave Stalin the pretext he needed for a crackdown.
Enter the secret police again, the OGPU.
Precisely. The OGPU, which later became the NKVD, then the KGB, they started hunting for counter-revolutionaries, believing, or claiming to believe, in this big conspiracy linking city intellectuals and rural peasants.
And the book mentions famine even back then, in 1928-29.
Yes, there was already famine hitting parts of Ukraine, but the Soviet authorities deliberately downplayed it, offered very limited concealed aid. The OGPU's priority wasn't feeding people, it was finding enemies.
This paranoia seems absolutely central.
It's crucial. The OGPU ramped up surveillance on anyone seen as a potential leader, peasant organizers, Ukrainian nationalists. This led to show trials like the one against Hryhorij Kolaby in the fake Union for the Liberation of Ukraine, or SVU case. Applebaum shows how the regime was already identifying and eliminating perceived threats well before the main famine hit.
Which brings us to the turning point.
Yeah.
Late 1929. Collectivization.
Yes. The push for rapid, forced collectivization, driven by the Party Central Committee, with Stalin now firmly in control after pushing out Bukharin, who favored more moderate policies.
And how was this implemented on the ground?
Brute force, essentially. Party cadres, activists were sent out to the villages to force peasants into these collective farms, the kolkhozes. And alongside this came dekulakization.
Dekulakization. defining and eliminating the kulaks.
Exactly. Identifying, seizing all property from, and deporting so-called kulaks, these supposedly wealthier peasants. And Ukraine was hit disproportionately hard, assigned much higher deportation quotas than other Soviet republics.
The book emphasizes how arbitrary this kulak label was, right?
Absolutely chillingly arbitrary. The definition was incredibly vague. Often, it just meant someone who resisted collectivization, maybe owned a slightly larger plot of land, perhaps employed a worker or two, or sometimes it was just someone the local activists didn't like. The anti-kulak propaganda was extreme, creating an enemy where often none really existed in that form.
Was there resistance?
Widespread resistance, yes. Applebaum documents it thoroughly. Protests, often led by women who were fiercely protective of their households, even armed uprisings, like in the Tulchin district. Peasants tried electing traditional village leaders again.
But the state's response?
Overwhelming, merciless force. Decolectivization itself was brutal. Applebaum describes families being stripped of literally everything they owned, evicted from their homes, and shipped off to remote, harsh regions Siberia. The far north, often with no resources, left to die.
The impact on farming must have been immediate.
Catastrophic, utterly catastrophic for agricultural output and devastating for peasant morale. People slaughtered their own livestock rather than hand it over to the collective.
Yet the pressure didn't let up.
Not at all. Despite the chaos, the falling production, the state kept demanding more. Applebaum details how high taxes and more deportations continued through 1930. Food shortages got worse, and the first real signs of mass starvation started appearing.
And then Molotov gets involved in 1931.
Yes, Vyacheslav Molotov, one of Stalin's key lieutenants. His intervention in Ukraine, as described in the book, was particularly harsh. He completely dismissed any reports of poor harvests or difficulties. He just blamed Ukrainian party officials for being incompetent at collecting grain.
So blame the victims, essentially, and to demand even more.
Exactly. The pressure on the collective farms became unbearable. Grain confiscation ramped up dramatically in late 31 and through 32. Activists, often local collaborators incentivized with a share of the loot, went house to house, taking everything, literally the last scraps of food.
Even as people were clearly starting to starve.
Yes. That's the horrifying part. Mortality rates were climbing, but the state demanded these impossible grain quotas. Local officials were often terrified, trying to hide the reality of the starvation, but the machine just kept grinding forward.
Then comes autumn 1932. Applebaum portrays this as a critical moment.
A crucial intensification. Stalin's paranoia was peaking, partly fueled by things like the Ryutin affair, a communist insider who dared to criticize Stalin's policies. Stalin started seeing plots and counter-revolution everywhere.
And this paranoia translated into policy.
Directly. Within that atmosphere, the Soviet Politburo made a series of decisions that Applebaum argues were absolutely central to widening and deepening the famine, turning it into the catastrophe it became.
What kind of decisions?
Key things, like explicitly banning peasants from leaving Ukraine to seek food elsewhere, trapping them, and intensifying grain requisitions to just impossible levels. They organized special teams, shock brigades of activists.
To go in and take
literally everything edible, confiscating all food found in homes, hidden grain, potatoes, beans, anything, leaving people with absolutely nothing.
And all the while, the official line was, there's no famine.
Complete denial. Worse than denial, active, systematic concealment. Applebaum documents the destruction of local records, birth and death registers altered, census data suppressed or falsified later on, a massive state-run cover-up.
And exporting grain at the same time.
Yes, that's one of the most damning points Applebaum makes. Grain was still being exported from Ukraine's ports while millions within the country were starving to death. It just starkly shows the regime's priorities. Political control, industrial goals, hard currency, all came before human lives.
So this leads into the absolute worst period, what Applebaum calls the height of the famine, 1932 to 1933.
Yes, this is when the full horror unfolds. The policies enacted in late 32 have their most devastating impact.
Like the blacklists. The Kornadoshka.
Exactly, a truly vicious tactic. Entire villages or collective farms that failed to meet the insane grain quotas were put on these blacklists.
What did that mean in practice?
It meant a total blockade. No goods could go in or out. No food supplies, no essential items. All trades stopped. It was effectively condemning the entire community to death by starvation.
People must have been desperate. trying to get out,
Mhm.
find food anywhere.
Absolutely desperate. Applebaum recounts heartbreaking stories, people trying to trade their last possessions, maybe clothes or tools, in Russian villages across the border where the hunger, while present, was often less extreme, trying to flee to cities for bread rations.
But the state blocked them.
Yes, they set up internal cordons, roadblocks, used troops and OGPU units to prevent peasants from leaving the famine zones, trapping them inside.
And then that January 1933 decree,
Mm.
blaming Ukrainization.
That was a really sinister, significant turn, blaming the earlier policy of promoting Ukrainian culture for the failures in grain collection. Applebaum argues convincingly this was a deliberate
A
pretext
pretext for what?
for escalating the attack on Ukrainian identity itself, cracking down hard on intellectuals, cultural figures, anyone associated with Ukrainization. It signaled that this wasn't just about grain, it was about breaking Ukraine nationally.
So arrests followed. Purges.
Mass arrests. The fabricated Orikhiv affair targeted Ukrainian communists. Purges swept through institutions like the Pedagogical Institute in Nizhyn. Ukrainian writers were banned, their works destroyed. Even the standard Ukrainian dictionary compiled under Mykola Skripnik was attacked and dismantled. It was a full-spectrum assault.
And back in the villages, what was the atmosphere like?
One of absolute terror and suspicion. The regime encouraged informers. Neighbors spied on neighbors. The laws against taking even tiny amounts of grain, even gleaning leftover stocks from the collective fields, were enforced with incredible brutality. Prison, labor camps, even execution for stealing a handful of grain to survive.
It's almost impossible to grasp the psychological state.
Applebaum touches on this. The way communists involved used euphemisms, avoiding the word famine or starvation. The way some city dwellers, influenced by propaganda, started to dehumanize the starving peasants. And the incentives for the activists.
They were rewarded for confiscating food.
Yes, they often received a percentage of the grain they seized, better rations, privileges. It created this horrifying dynamic of complicity in the suffering. Figures like Lazar Kaganovich were instrumental in pushing these brutal methods.
And the book describes the physical reality.
Unflinchingly. The descriptions are harrowing. Dying children, corpses lying unburied in streets along roadsides, people literally dying while trying to eat a scrap of found food.
Social breakdown must have been total.
Complete breakdown of norms. Applebaum recounts instances of terrible violence, lynchings over stolen food. A pervasive indifference to suffering develops, a numbness, and then the accounts of cannibalism.
That's mentioned.
Yes. Initially rumors, but confirmed as a dreadful reality born of the absolute extremity of hunger. People arrested for it. It shows the utter depths of desperation and societal collapse.
How did anyone survive?
Incredible resilience, desperation, eating weeds, tree bark, rodents, anything imaginable, begging, searching garbage heaps in towns.
And then there were the Turks in shops.
The hard currency store.
Yes. A cruel paradox. If you happen to have any gold, silver, or foreign currency, any heirlooms, maybe remittances from abroad, you could exchange them for food at these state-run Torkson shops.
So a lifeline for a tiny few.
A tiny few.
But Applebaum notes the deep bitterness this created. Watching people starve while the state extracted the last valuables in exchange for food. Even the limited food transfers coming through Torkson, while vital for those who got them, were just a drop in the ocean compared to the scale of the starvation.
And the peak was spring 1933.
That's identified as the absolute nadir, yes, the highest mortality rates. After that, things began to slowly, agonizingly recede from the very worst point, though death and suffering continued.
Were some areas hit harder than others?
Yes, Applebaum notes regional variations. Central and eastern Ukraine were devastated. Areas bordering Poland and Romania might have fared slightly better, perhaps due to some cross-border smuggling or interaction, but the scale was immense everywhere.
Did the regime offer any relief eventually?
Very limited concessions came only later, in 1934, like not requisitioning vegetables, but it was far too late for the millions who had already died. And then came the resettlement campaigns.
Bringing people into the depopulated areas.
Yes, bringing settlers, often from Russia, into the villages emptied by famine and deportation. Many Ukrainians saw this, Applebaum suggests, as a deliberate Russification effort, changing the demographic fabric of the region.
And throughout all this and afterwards, the denial continued.
Complete, total, unwavering denial by the Soviet state. That's a central theme. No official records kept of the victims as famine victims. Any discussion suppressed through fear, arrests, violence. Census results that revealed the demographic catastrophe were falsified. It was an active erasure of the event from history.
And they worked to suppress the truth internationally, too.
Oh, absolutely. Applebaum details the manipulation of foreign journalists. The infamous case of Walter Duranty of the New York Times, who publicly downplayed the famine while privately acknowledging its severity. And conversely, the smearing and discrediting of journalists like Gareth Jones, who bravely reported the truth.
So inside Ukraine, people just couldn't talk about it.
Not publicly. For decades, it was the great forbidden subject, a collective silence imposed by fear. Of course, Applebaum notes, the memory survived privately, in families, through oral histories passed down by survivors.
Was it ever mentioned during, say, the Nazi occupation?
It was sometimes brought up, but often manipulated for Nazi propaganda purposes, sometimes linked with anti-Semitic tropes. Not a genuine reckoning.
So the silence continued after the war.
Absolutely. Throughout the post-war Soviet period, any attempt to speak or write about the Holodomor could lead to severe persecution. Applebaum credits the Ukrainian diaspora, those who emigrated, especially to North America, with keeping the memory alive, collecting testimonies, and pushing for recognition in the West.
Until Glasnost.
Exactly. The late 1980s, under Gorbachev's Glasnost, finally allowed the silence to begin breaking within Ukraine itself. Archives started opening slightly, testimonies emerged. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 accelerated this process dramatically.
Leading to independent Ukraine recognizing it as genocide.
Yes, Ukraine officially recognizes the Holodomor as an act of genocide against the Ukrainian people. This remains a complex and debated topic, historically and politically, especially given contemporary Russian narratives, which often still try to minimize it, deny its deliberate nature, or frame it solely as part of a wider Soviet famine.
So Applebaum's final conclusion really hammers home the deliberate nature.
Absolutely. She argues forcefully that the Holodomor wasn't an accident, wasn't just mismanagement. It was the outcome of intentional Soviet policies aimed squarely at crushing Ukrainian national aspirations. Policies preceded by dehumanizing language, by hate speech against peasants that paved the way for mass murder.
Red Famine really paints a devastating picture. A man-made catastrophe, state terror, and then decades of denial.
It's a stark and deeply troubling account. The sheer scale of the engineered starvation, the deliberate targeting of a national group, and the lengths the regime went to conceal it, it underscores the profound culpability.
So wrapping up this incredibly important deep dive into Red Famine, the key takeaways seem starkly clear. This wasn't just a famine, it was, as Applebaum argues, a deliberate act engineered to break the Ukrainian people, suppress their identity. The sheer scale of that suffering, and then the decades spent trying to erase it from history. It's profoundly disturbing. It really demands our attention, our understanding.
It really does. And studying this history forces us to ask some very tough questions, doesn't it? How does understanding the Holodomor change how we view state power, the resilience of national identity against such brutality, and, maybe most relevant today, the ways truth itself can be manipulated, suppressed?
And what responsibility do we have, as individuals, as societies, to confront these kinds of difficult, buried histories?
Exactly. Those are the vital questions that linger long after you finish the book.
Profound questions indeed. Thank you so much for joining us for this crucial deep dive today.